consider, for example, the fundamental human goods of love, companionship, sex, family, pleasure, commitment. And there's, of course, the very public recognition of a fundamental change in status based on consent and contractual agreement. At the very least, LGBT would be considered morally neutral, as indeed heterosexuality should be considered. So virtue ethics, for example, is one ethical theory that would consider it to be morally neutral. You would get neither moral credit nor moral blame for being gay or straight. It's certainly not required to be one or the other. The point is it's not forbidden to be one or the other. Therefore, it is permissible. It is permissible to be one or the other. So here's what we need to consider at first. What makes something morally wrong? That's the fundamental question. Now, there are unlimited ways of being morally wrong. The question is, how do we determine whether something is morally right or wrong? Now, when we do that, in practice, despite what some moral philosophers have thought, we don't actually use some one ethical or moral theory. Rather, we apply any number of different perspectives. Switching that off. We apply a number of different ethical perspectives. We bring these things to bear, and different kinds of considerations and perspectives. So we think, for example, both about individual rights, but also about the greater good. We're going to talk about this in terms of, let's say, utilitarianism, which wants to see the greatest good for the greatest number of people. We consider the will of the majority, but also the rights of minorities. So we have a number of considerations, or what we could call tests, of what makes something morally right or wrong. And something that fails one or more of our tests would be considered morally wrong. That is bad, to be avoided. Something potentially to be outlawed, or at least regulated, unless there was some overriding good reason. There's at least, among these moral theories, broad consensus on this. According to any of these theories, the primary moral wrong is to cause harm. To cause harm. Now, sometimes it's necessary or justified to cause a certain kind of harm. So we need to refine that statement and say something like, to cause needless harm to others without an overriding good reason. We can state this as a general principle. That is, in general, causing unnecessary and unjustified harm to others is always morally wrong, in the absence of some overriding good reason. There must be an overriding good reason to justify the infliction of harm. And the degree of moral wrongness of a particular act is usually proportionate to the degree of harm that's caused. And harm, what is harm? Well, harm is about violating one's person, one's property, one's interests, one's rights. Doing harm, maybe involving someone in something which they wouldn't have consented to, doing something to someone without their consent, or in a way in which they could not have consented had they known what was going on. Again, there's no limit to the ways in which one may harm others or be harmed by others. But the point is this, it is not at all apparent, not to my analysis, and not after I run it through these different theories, how being gay, how same-sex relationships cause any harm. It is not at all apparent. Therefore, LGBT is not morally wrong. That's the beginning of my analysis. The arguments against same-sex marriage all depend upon the premise that LGBT is morally wrong or bad. And that is not a true premise. It cannot be assumed. In the absence of any compelling reason, and none has been provided, there is no justification for this central and fundamental premise that it's morally wrong. Now, I will shortly, towards the end of my talk, be considering some of the attempts at giving compelling reasons, but none of them succeeds. It has never been established that LGBT is morally wrong. It is not at all obvious. No apparent harm is involved. So why would it be wrong? What two consenting adult persons do sexually, if it harms no one, is their right and their prerogative, in the absence of an overriding good reason. And what I want to suggest is that, of course, religion is not an overriding good reason. And I'm about to explain that under the heading, religion is not the moral and legal standard. So, most important to keep in mind here as we consider this issue, it seems to me, is that as far as the moral and legal standards of our country are concerned, religion does not settle moral questions. Of course, for individuals, doubtless for many people, religion does settle such questions. Religious assumptions are, in some sense, fundamental for many people's personal morality. But all that that can do is determine their own personal behavior and their moral code of conduct. So people may disapprove of being LGBT on, let's say, religious or theological grounds, but that does not entitle them to declare that it is morally wrong. It is not morally wrong by any of the tests that determine moral rightness or wrongness. That's not how morality works. In a civil society, as ours is, based upon the rational principles of liberty, justice for all, some one version of some one religion does not determine what is morally right and wrong, what is permissible, what is forbidden, what is required. And this was a major step forward in theories of justice, of law, of human rights, namely that morality is and must be autonomous from religion. That is, not only free from its influence, but morality must be defensible, it must be justifiable without recourse to religion and religious presuppositions. Because, of course, we cannot expect everyone to share our religious presuppositions, nor can we expect to make our own personal religious morality the law of the land. So, if you are personally opposed to same-sex marriage, then by all means, you should personally avoid it. You can refuse to give it your blessing. What you cannot do is prevent or outlaw it. You cannot even condemn it as morally wrong. The religious interpretation of some subset of the population is not what determines moral rightness, wrongness, or neutrality. And this point, it seems to me, needs to be much better understood. Religion may explain why the majority of opponents are against same-sex marriage. I think it does explain why. But it does not establish that they are right in being opposed to it. The major monotheistic religions said LGBT was morally wrong. So, many people believe that it is. But religion is no longer a good reason. It's no longer an argument at all. No appeal to religious morality is justifiable in this connection for two crucial reasons. I really want to emphasize these points. There are two crucial conditions that it would be impossible to establish. You would have to show, number one, that your religion was the right religion, was the true authority. And that is something which is impossible to prove either with logic or with science. And two, it would have to be established that your particular version of the morality dictated by that religion is the correct and the warranted interpretation. Since even within a religion, there are serious differences about any number of substantive moral questions. That is, it is not the case that all Christians are opposed to LGBT or same-sex marriage. Certainly not. That's an empirical fact. Not all Christians are opposed to same-sex marriage. So, I'm quite sure, as a matter of fact, that many Christians would reject the phrase that has entered our cultural vernacular, much to the shame and discredit of the religious far right, that, quote, God hates fags. That theological proposition, if we can call it that, arrogates to itself the right to speak for God. But I would say that if this is supposed to represent a Christian view, then this kind of self-righteous hatred really just speaks for itself. The point here is that it is not biblical morality as such. It is some particular interpretation of biblical morality, claimed to be the true and correct one. Well, these start getting into some very high-level metaphysical presuppositions, which means that they're extremely questionable as premises in a moral argument. We call this begging the question. That is, an argument which begins from these assumptions, not proving them, but starting from them. That's not a compelling argument, not even to some other Christians. To cite biblical texts as though that settled the matter is already to assume that the Bible has overriding authority, when it does not. But even to other Christians who may accept the authority of the Bible, one would still have to establish that one has the true and correct interpretation of all of the relevant texts taken together. We nearly always find some creative picking and choosing in biblical interpretation, where some moral imperatives are insisted upon, while others, which come directly from